arts from the man. This is my own David Bowden from the Battle of Ideas Festival. And obviously it's a question that's been on the lips of a lot of people over the past 12 months of sort of bicentenary of Wagner. But just to remind you, we have Hilan, who's the film director with us, who's also writes and lectures extensively on Wagner. Has just finished teaching a course on romanticism and film at Columbia University. We're delighted to be able to fly over from New York here, especially for the screening, as well as Alan Miller to my right, who's a co-founder of the Truman Brewery here in London and co-director of the New York Salon, a regular discussion forum in New York, inspired by the Battle of Ideas. And he's a filmmaker, broadcaster, and cultural commentator. And as I say, has raced back from chairing or speaking at a series of satellites in Amsterdam to be with us today. And Igor, who is our Wagner skeptic from the arts desk. But I just want to start with you, Hilan. Is what was your motivation for making this film? I mean, is it to try and explain why Israel had placed such a strong aversion to playing the work of Wagner? Is it an attempt to try and to actually sort of say we should be able to overcome the man's politics for the sake of the music? What was the real purpose you were trying to make on the film? We are recording, by the way, so if everyone could speak into the microphones.
Well, as with many films, the initial impetus was a sort of personal identification with a story, or something that I found very resonant about it. I first read about Wagner's Corps of Jewish Assistants some years ago when I was researching another project, and it immediately seized my imagination, and I just wanted to find out more about it. I mean, who are these people? What drew them to Wagner? What drew him to them? What were these relationships like? And once I started looking into it, the stories of these relationships were even more dramatic and even more nuanced than I had expected. And it was a subject that I suspect the reason that it resonated with me is because I can certainly relate to this sense of ambivalence about Wagner. I'm a musician by training, and my first exposure to Wagner's music was as a violinist in various youth orchestras, playing his music, and then I was a conducting student, so I had the opportunity to study and conduct his orchestral music in that environment. I also grew up in a household where Wagner was not played. My mother is Israeli, and whenever her view on Wagner is very much, was very tied up with the understanding of his anti-Semitism and that whole set of issues. So whenever Wagner came on in the radio was turned off. So for me, my first encounters with Wagner were powerfully ambivalent ones. It was music that I found to be electrifying and very unlike much other music, especially because it was new for me. And at the same time, I was given to understand that this was a man who was essentially wicked and who wanted nothing good for the people that I belonged to. So I've had a push-pull relationship with Wagner for a long time, and I suspect that's why I was drawn to this subject, rather than, as you suggested, making the case for either side. I wanted to just sort of expose the nuances on both sides, and that was actually very important for me to try and unfasten some of the easy generalizations that have been made on both sides about this topic.
Yeah, no, and it's certainly fascinating to be able to get some of the sort of depth and nuance. It is kind of it's often discussed Wagner in those terms. But I mean, what I kind of grapple with, and I'm probably interested to hear from both Alan and Igor, is that obviously it can be very easy to say with artists, we understand that an artist can be a flawed human being, and yet they can produce works of great beauty. But obviously, I guess part of the struggle around Wagner, it's not just the fact that he was an unpleasant character and had unpleasant views, but the content of the work does. There is there's Christian mysticism, there's a kind of nationalism. It's not something you can easily enjoy a Wagner opera and entirely forget about what the views of this man are. Or is that maybe just am I just so overloaded on on the attitude towards Wagner's anti-Semitism I can't separate myself from.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think, in the words of Auden, he was an absolute shit. I mean, that's a quote from Auden. He was a thoroughly nasty man. He was worse than an anti-Semite. He was a misanthrope. He hated humanity. One of the worst things that that Wotan can do in the Ring Cycle is to make Brunhilde a human, a mere wife, a mere woman. That to him is disgusting, beneath what most people should try to achieve, try to aim for, which is to be beyond human, which he claimed to sort of be very good at. So no, I think that the real problem here is lots of people were anti-Semites, Chopin, Schumann, Liszt. The point is that it permeates his music, not just anti-Semitism, but a glorification of a sort of annihilation of humanity. It's his lust for death in a way that no other opera composer really sort of mimics. I mean, he lusts after death. He lusts after sort of. There's a sort of suicidal instinct, there's the homicidal instinct, there's the holocaustal instinct in the Ring Cycle, which he thinks is the only way to deal with any problem, is to basically kill someone, yourself or others around you. That is the problem with Wagner.
Alan?
Yeah, before I think he quite possibly could be anti-human, and he did indeed have very terrible views that were very nasty. I mean, interestingly, just before I came here, I was rushing and I was at the hotel, and I said they were printing off something for me, and I said I'm going to do the speech on Wagner, and the woman who was at the receptionist turned and said, "Oh yes, you can hear it in his music. It's terrible, da 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 da." And I was like, okay, and we'll come back to that, because the thing is, another interesting anecdote is that Theodor Herzl, when he was writing The Jewish State, was obsessed with Wagner. And he loved him, and he often went to see Wagner operas. And I think the thing is that if we look at all sorts of artists, Shakespeare could be one of them, there are many, that sometimes their work could embody things that we find very disconcerting, outrageous, and very difficult to deal with. But I think we have to make a distinction between the actual work and the ideas and the views, because also what I really liked about your film, and I must say congratulations, I think it's a really remarkable film, it's really brilliant, but what I really liked about the film is I think Leon Bonstein's points that sometimes we look at the lens through what's happened subsequent to things, right? So he says we look at the lens quite understandably through the prism of the Holocaust back at Wagner, but I mean, and that I think to say that he has a Holocaustal attitude through the music sort of takes what's specific about something that happens subsequent to that.
He calls for the annihilation of the world at the end of the Ring Cycle. That is what happens. That
as a slight correction, it's calling for the destruction of the world of the gods.
Yeah, sure, okay.
Which would actually tend, and yeah.
Okay, so you got to carry on. Or?
Sure, no.
Okay, yeah.
Well, no, I think the problem actually is, there is. I mean, you really read the Judaism in Music's text, because it's often dismissed as sort of pertaining to cultural theory, but it reminds one of a sort of anti-Jewish film by the Nazis. I mean, in terms of the way that he goes through each element of a classic rampant anti-Semite. He hates their visual features. I mean, he has a particular dislike for their disgusting, repellent visual features. This is a really uncommon anti-Semitism, which is what the film brought out. Even by the standards of the time, he was unbelievably repugnant.
Well, I'm not exactly sure if that's true. I mean, there's a good anecdote of when Schumann ushers out and throws Liszt out of his house because even he cannot bear the anti-Semitism that Liszt is saying around 1848. But I think the thing is, if you look at other things that Wagner wrote and said as well, a lot of it was nihilistic. We may well call him an anarchist today. He certainly wasn't about the state, but Nietzsche comments about his work, that perhaps it's Madame Bovary with music. Slightly superficial, his comments on him, but I think the point is that I mean, and I'm not sure what if you would advocate banning him or saying that he should not be performing.
I think just be very careful, because if you actually follow the logic of his operas, the drama that he writes, because he's a poet as well as a composer, and this is what distinguishes him from Schumann and Beethoven and da-da-da-da, being a terribly dramatic, perhaps sort of violent beginning to a piece of music, is he puts set words to these texts. So we know what he means by the music, and also we know even more so because the themes are clear and written about. So this is what distinguishes him. We must remember that the operas themselves sort of advocate for these things.
Hilan, do you want to?
I think it's an excellent point about the fact that Wagner is a librettist also, and the question of can we separate the man from the art, I think there actually needs to be teased apart a little. I would say there are really two questions. First of all, is the man separate from his art? And then can we separate the man from his art? Now, is the man separate from his art? I would say the answer is unequivocally no. Wagner was not only a composer and not only a librettist, but he set himself up as a cultural seer of sorts. It was very important for him to be seen as an avatar of a new sort of German culture, a new sort of mass culture, which in many ways has been very influential in the 20th and 21st centuries, of the influence of Wagner and of Wagnerian techniques on film and media is a fascinating subject, which definitely repays close scrutiny. So in many ways he looked ahead of his time in more ways than one. And so his anti-Semitism is absolutely relevant to the art and to the way in which he wants the art to be perceived. And so I don't think that one can separate the man from... The man is not separate from his art. Now, can he be separated from his art? Well, there I think history shows us that we can, if not separate the man from his art, then separate our reception of the art from the man. I mean, one thing that gets lost in the discussions of this is that Wagner is doing very well. And here I actually have to slightly differ with the way that the question in this debate is posed. I think the question was phrased as, can we ever accept him as merely another artist without reference to his nationalism and unpleasant views? Well, I mean, go to Wagner's works are at the center of the international opera repertory, which is appropriate. There are the Wagner scholarship world is alive and well. There are Wagner journals. There's studies of Wagner coming from the most prestigious publishing houses, and not only to do with his anti-Semitism, and in fact the reception of different individuals, including people who had no sympathy with his anti-Semitism, people like Herzl or people like many Jewish composers who lived after Wagner's time and therefore outside the purview of this film. When you look at the influence that he had on Mahler or Schoenberg or Korngold, it's obvious that history has separated the man from his work in certain respects. If you look at the influence that Wagner's had on the use of leitmotifs in film scores, is every Hollywood film score that uses leitmotifs an endorsement of anti-Semitic views? Of course not. So in this sense, Wagner's achievements escaped even his control, which I'm sure he would be quite irate about. And yet there's no getting away from the reality of what is bound up with that art. And as you can probably see from the film, I personally am not in favor of whitewashing that. I think that you have to admit that yes, there are these views that are bound up with the ethos of many of the works. I would agree with a great deal of what Igor said. And so then the question becomes, can we separate the man from his art? I say no. But then the question becomes, so what?
But look at his heroes. I mean, it goes beyond this. I really feel like what we should be looking at is his understanding of humanity. And I feel his greatest failing is having essentially a very poor idea of what it means to be a good human being. His heroes, his ideal of man is Siegfried, this insufferable tosser who goes around, essentially beating up his poor father, Mima, his stepfather, he was adopted by this figure, Mima, and who yes, has ulterior motives for him ultimately, but he's brought him up and he behaves much worse than any sort of, rebellious teenager. He is vile, racist thug towards this man who's adopted him, and that's all he knows about him, and he's disgusting. And this is a paragon of humanity.
Does Siegfried's moral insipidity make The Ring any less great of an artwork?
Yeah, I think it does, because he's our great hero. I also think it's not just Siegfried, that every time he is offered a choice, we're offered a choice between what is sort of value in being a human and what's not. He picks the wrong choice, Wagner. Look at Wolfram, who's an incredibly decent fellow who should be the hero of that opera, and he isn't. It's Tannhauser, this another tosser. You look at several other operas. There's a lot to be said for Fricka and her understanding of the law and what the law provides. And actually, we go with these hot-headed, arrogant men.
I want to bring Alan in.
You see, this is where I think the distinction between what informs the ideas of the characters or in the story and the actual musical work itself. There's also a distinction, and I think that one ends up insulting the audience somewhat to a certain extent, because I think that I don't think it's the case that you can say that the work is any less profound or moving or beautiful or any of those things because of his particular views, and I happen to agree with the point that he is intertwined with his art and his work himself, as all artists are, but I don't happen to think that it makes the work any less profound or important or beautiful. I happen to think that it can take you away on a journey, it can be transcendent. Actually, we impose lots of our own views on those things. As you develop your palette with all of this, with music and stories, you hear more and you see more. But I think it's wrong to say that it's anti-human. I think it sometimes embodies some of the best things in there. I mean, one of the things I think that we should remember about Wagner is he always also represents a turning point in music. And the thing about destruction and clash and overthrow is also about the established order. And this is not to whitewash his anti-Semitism. He absolutely was an anti-Semite and he absolutely had despicable views. I would not want to have him at a dinner party or have him be my friend. But if I use that yardstick about artists generally, I may never listen to any artists or see any artists because there's many, in fact most of them I disagree with, many I think have abhorrent and reprehensible views. And if one starts using that as a yardstick, it becomes very problematic. Also, it takes away from the ability for the audience just to engage with the work and be moved or not, if you impose this notion that somehow it's more flawed because of that.
Look at the work. I say look at the work, and you should not sort of imbibe this stuff. It's dangerous stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the questions that I wanted to. I mean, that's why I posed the question in this regard, because I know Wagner is revered amongst the. There is a continuing cult of Wagner that exists. He's a composer who attracts a kind of sort of fierce loyalty to him. He had a loyalty within his own time from his musicians and from his fans now. But the thing is that we still discuss the question of his anti-Semitism. I mean, that is every single discussion we have around Wagner is still foregrounded with the aspect of his life. So, well, I mean, that seems to be, at least from the popular discourse. I come from the land of the popular discourse. I understand amongst opera fans that there's a different way of understanding Wagner, but as somebody who has come to opera later in life, that's what you understand Wagner to be: is anti-Semitism, and then fat ladies singing, and a kind of high camp quality. And there is a kind of aspect. I mean, you call this a middle class addiction.
Yeah, I do. I think it's a terrible middle class addiction. I mean, if only the people in the audience actually, paid any attention to his, Schopenhauerian unity and death guff. They'd just go off and fling themselves off a cliff. Instead they come sort of, overfed and underwashed, And you know, they're pretty despicable crowds, audiences, Wagnerian audiences.
I mean,
I will bring you in. It's good to see you have questions. I'm going to go out to the audience in just a second. But
I'm just going to say that I think one of the criticisms that can be made of Wagner is that he did not always appreciate the intelligence of his audiences, and his art is not a very subtle one. But I have to say that your anti-Wagnerian criticism partakes of much the same flaw.
I think that was it's a very anti-humanist point you made, and actually, I was actually really impressed by the way you showed and demonstrated the interrelationship between German and other Jewry and Wagner, and the way that culture has had an influence on one another, and you know, the profound nature of that thing. I mean, Tchaikovsky was also a terrible anti-Semite, also does wonderful music, and people don't talk about banning Tchaikovsky or Liszt or others, maybe because you could say his work's not as popular or not as profound, but I do think it's a tragedy that you can't have, for instance, in Israel, since Toscanini's 38, you know, that unofficial ban, you can't have a Robert Lepage performance like you have at the Met, like it or not, in Israel, and the points were really rightly made that Israeli musicians and Jewish musicians cannot perform there, although people can listen on the radio and they may see it on a DVD. And I think Asher Fish's point that, you know, I think he really wants to be able to take that back, almost like a sentiment that a Jew could perform that in Israel, and that would be the best antidote to the notion of Hitler owning Wagner, as he might own Beethoven or anyone else. I mean, that
couldn't. The point is, I mean, it's an interesting one, because actually, in Nazi Germany, you know, it's famous that actually, while they propagated this idea that Wagner was a sort of state composer, no one really wants to listen to him. Inevitably, you know, during times of war, you don't. You want to listen to ephemeral stuff to get your mind off what was going on around you, which was what was happening in Wagner's operas, which was death on a vast scale, which is what Wagner loved most. So actually Verdi and Lehar were much more frequently composed, especially, you know, towards the sort of ring cycle end of the war.
Okay, I'm gonna bring questions because there's a lot from. Just to let you know, we take in Battle of Ideas self formats. We try to take rounds of questions. So if you have questions, feel free to put your hand up, and we'll try and squeeze you all in. Don't treat it like a straightforward Q&A. I think, and if you could wait for the person with the microphone to come to you. So there's a woman at the back, and then there's Claire Fox in front of her, and then there's also another chap over there. So we'll take. Okay, we'll take 3 questions to start off with. Sorry? Okay, we'll take this question from the front here first. And then, sorry.
Speaking to the mic. Okay, I wanted to address, is it Eagle?
Yes.
Your comments about the libretto and the music. Because I think people, I'm just asking really whether it's the case, that the popularity of Wagner has continued to such an extent because of the music. I don't think they relate tremendously to the libretto when they go to the operas. They may know exactly what's going to happen in the story, but I don't know if they follow, you know, the fundamental story. I think they mostly just listen to the music.
But that's going against what Wagner wanted, which he really didn't. You know, his favourite singer was Wilhelmina Schroeder-Devrient, and what he said about her was that she had no voice at all. He didn't care about the singing. He cared about the acting. He cared about the story. He cared that you understood his idea of humanity, of politics, of religion. This is what he cared about.
Okay, can I just try and take some more questions? We'll take a group of questions and then I'll let people come back. So if you just want to go, there's basically 2 in the middle up there. If you're just behind you. Okay. Oh, sorry. You first.
Isn't it perhaps the big issue behind all this discussion is the German problem of identity? Is the Germans are people who felt constantly missed the bus of history, despite their talents and achievements. And the period between 1870 to 1945 was a desperate attempt to undo that, which led to Hitler. Hence the overweening arrogance and contempt of other people. It's precisely because, and this is still a problem in Germany today, Germans have a terrible self-hatred, in some respect, understandably so, and a terrible inferiority complex. They've been overshadowed by the French, our cosy British culture. They never really made it, and therefore the projection of this diabolical other, who interestingly was highly assimilated to German culture, was a way psychologically of dealing with that problem, their feeling of inferiority and being set aside by the Europeans.
Okay, and then if you could take the two in the middle, just right behind you, and then I'll take some responses because I think we've already got quite a few big questions on the table. I suspect that maybe we've come by. We'll come back out for more questions. So I've seen you over there and a couple of others. But.
There was an interesting moment, Igor, when you started telling us who Wagner should have made the heroes of his opera, and that you decided that you wanted a different character to be a good character, which indicates the fact that Wagner created a range of characters. You just don't like the ones he happened to make the heroes, but he created all of those characters, actually brought to life people that you're going to have arguments about whether you like them or don't. So it seems to me that rather defeated the point of that you were making, which is that Wagner is an artist. I don't care what Wagner wanted us to think when we watch his opera. People want you to think all sorts of things when they write their poetry or write their novels, but they become great works of art, transcend that. Most sacred music want me, when I listen to it, to pray to God. It doesn't do that. It's absolutely, as an atheist, I never think of God. I think of humanity and I think of the music, and I transcend the wishes of the composers. So that seems, on the one hand, to be important. But the other thing that I thought that was remarkable about some of the things you said was I'm a great critic of misanthropy and anti-humanism myself. I find it alive and well, by the way, in the kind of contemporary environmentalist movements, and there's many of the ideas in Wagner's work which are kind of that back to the land kind of ideas, which I find rather, anti-human and certainly not politically what I would agree with. But it seems again to me that you're overplaying it, because actually what really worked in Wagner's work is the love stories at the heart of them. I don't mean in any, obviously, Mills and Boon type of way. There's a huge amount of love for humanity, as expressed through the love that many of the characters have for each other. That's the bit you seem to have missed. So you seem to be over-literally interpreting these operas, not allowing the audience, by the way, to make their own mind up. I mean, you've treated us as though we're idiots. You treat everybody who watches them as idiots. And then all of those Jewish people who were in the play, in the fantastic documentary that we've seen, presumably they must have been real idiots, because they carried on admiring Wagner even as he was creating these works, which you think they couldn't understand to really be saying. They knew he was an anti-Semite, they knew what his views were, but they loved the music and admired him as a man and as an artist, as many Jews do today, as many humans do today, even though he was a misanthropic anti-humanist as a character.
Okay, if you just want to pass it behind you, then I'll take some responses to the panel after this, but afterwards, if you could go to that man in the blue jumper for the next round of questions afterwards, so it shows I haven't forgotten them. Yep.
Yeah, I've got to say I completely agree with Claire that you were showing far too much respect to how Wagner wanted to be portrayed. He wrote all those books saying, I'm the new kind of revolutionary artist, I've directed this, I've written the libretto, and it's all in the music. But of course, in the prime example of how we can separate the music from the man is actually Hilan's documentary, because he uses all these clips from the music while we have this kind of sinister image of Wagner, and we're kind of thinking, yeah, he is really evil. And obviously that's kind of shown how the kind of emotive language of the music, which was around before Wagner was there, he's playing with all these traditions and motifs that he didn't just create out of nowhere, and it's lasted and it's in film music now. He's shown us that the music obviously has a kind of language of itself outside of Wagner. And now if you think of the different contexts, the different directors, there's room for a complete parody with the kind of the way you play with the libretto on the stage. Then the music can be used and played with in any other kind of, to kind of show the completely opposite point.
Okay, responses to Hilan?
Can I just say I'm so happy that you said that, because it's one aspect of the film that I'm happy that an audience member noticed was the use of the music. The film is very critical of at times of Wagner as a person because of the subject matter, but it is aesthetically, I think it's in a sense a Wagnerian film. I mean, there's a lot of Wagnerian music in the film, and it's used leitmotivically, which was very deliberate on my part. And then I actually did put thought into which quotes from the operas I had to represent.
You would hate it, obviously.
Perhaps. The other thing I wanted to say to Igor, just to add one last thing, that I think that Wagner would have been absolutely delighted to hear the things that you were saying. Because what the man wanted very badly was to be at the center of scandal. He said a lot of things that I think were absolutely intended to provoke. And this is something I'd like to introduce. I think one of the motivations for absolutely being so vocal about his anti-Semitism was that he really was one of the first people to understand that there's no such thing as bad publicity. There's a quote that's in the film where he says, a friend has, it's before he publishes the essay for the first time, a friend has told me that, here in Paris you either have to have money or you have to make people afraid of you, or I want to commit acts of artistic terrorism. He wanted to make a stink. That friend, by the way, was Bologna, who was Liszt's publicist, who was an absolute wizard at creating sensations and creating, sensational hype around his man, for the most part, Liszt. But Wagner wrote that essay at a time when he was struggling to make a living. He was penniless, he was a refugee, and he thought partly to make a living as a journalist. When he republishes the essay, it's 1869, he enters an incredibly fragile time in the debate over the German Jews. And this gets back to your point. The Germans were having a crisis of identity. They had just, Bismarck was unifying more and more of Germany for the first time in a very long time. The Jews had just been granted civil rights in all the territories controlled by Prussia. And again, Wagner puts himself out there into the center of this controversy by republishing this essay from 20 years earlier. And he makes himself the focal point of this debate, whether for pro or for contra. And so he cared very much about being seen as the bad boy of Western culture. And a lot of what we talk about when we talk about Wagner is the transgressive elements of his work, not just about the Jews, by the way, but about the sexually transgressive messages that you get in Die Walküre, or Tristan und Isolde, or his apparent antagonism to certain social forces. So if he heard you talking, I think he'd be rubbing his hands. He would love this. Because once again, we're giving him a lot of credit as this evil, anti-human guy, probably a little too much credit. So my question to you is, in this debate over can we separate the art from the man, is the focus on Wagner's anti-Semitism somehow detracting from his music, from the renown of his music? Is it possible that the opposite is the case? That actually the controversy, the edginess over his anti-Semitism has actually given Wagner a kind of transgressive, controversial appeal in a way that it wouldn't otherwise have had. And if you think I'm being cynical, I really do think that Wagner, that's the way he thought. Before he republished the essay he wrote to Hans von Bülow, one of his close colleagues, I know this will create a hullabaloo. And he was right, and I think that he would be delighted if he heard some of the things that are being said.
Well, music to Wagner's ears. Igor.
Fine. I'm not that interested. I think something that we should be focusing on also is the way that it has repercussions on how we view artists in general. Because the past 10 years there's been a definite rowing back of this idea that his anti-Semitism matters and his misanthropy matters and that his plots matter and that so much else doesn't matter. We're left with barely anything, but we're left with the music, which I don't doubt is brilliant and it totally bewitches me. I listen to it a lot. It's incredibly seductive, dangerous stuff, as I say. But the thing is that what this does is this elevates the artist beyond the level of debate, of moral debate. Whatever they do, it doesn't matter. Let's just focus on their art, and this leads to people whitewashing Britain's legacy. The fact that he's a paedophile is completely kind of looked over, and it absolutely is, because if you read John Brighart's book on Britain, for example, there is definitely one case in which he basically tried to rape a boy, and the boy had to Harry Stein, I think it was Harry something, I can't remember the surname. He had to fend him off with a chair. And throughout this year, there's been repeated articles that say that he, whatever his proclivities in his head, he never tried it on with anyone. And that's a big lie. And it's published, and no one wishes to actually admit that. And this goes on and on and on, and we get unbelievably irate. So Graham Ovenden, who's just been imprisoned for sexual offences, suddenly all his works are discredited as a result of him going to prison. Now, I'm saying that what Wagner does, what we do by whitewashing him, by forgetting what an anti-humanist he was in his plots, and that is what we should focus on, in his operas, in his works, we elevate the artist beyond moral judgment, and we then can't really make better. We sort of elevate art beyond criticism. We consider artists as greater than normal humans. We consider art as something that is greater and should be invested more money in, more time to than any other profession. And that, I think, is unhelpful and unfair and leads to sort of, Polanski-type cases.
Okay, yeah, I'm just going to say I'm going to be debating or discussing with John Bridcott about Britain's legacy and biography actually next week at the Battle of Ideas as that happens, as I say. So if you're interested in that question, do come along to that. Alan?
Well, I'm interested in the idea that it's dangerous, and it ties into a point that was raised at the front here about German identity. And I think a lot of your opinion in life depends on what you think about people. If you think that people are rational and can make decisions and can be sensible, and also can make mistakes, but they can use discrimination, and they can have a thing where they can ponder on things, they can sit on it, they can be won over to better ideas or not, and you basically have a real respect for humans, and then you have a position towards them, which is that they're not just stupid, they're not going to be subsumed by this latent racism, this latent fascism within them, but when they understand the notion of the music, suddenly get overwhelmed with this Teutonic, Norse-like Nazi thing, and then they go out and kill everyone, because that's highly insulting. And in a way, I think it speaks to the identity of German thing as well. It is true that there were questions of identity in Germany, as elsewhere, the late development of the nation state there, and the way the bourgeois class was grappling with that and what that meant for different groups. But it's also true that he, as an artist, was massively informed, as many of the great artists were, by turbulent times. Attempts to transform society, to bring into modernity a nation state, which was a legacy that carried on. He was part of, and he reflected, as the greatest artists, in my opinion, reflect what's happening in the world in a really insightful, profound, tremendous, sometimes magical way. But they're reflecting something that's around them. And our engagement with that, this notion that somehow that it's beyond the power of somehow, it's too dangerous for us to hear, as though we're children, that it will overwhelm us. And I think in a way, whilst it's entirely understandable why someone who went through the Holocaust and the experience of that would not want to hear something. I mean, it's tragic. You think about the worst of what was possible, the greatest accomplishment of humanity, right? Classical music, along with other great works of art, played at the gas chambers. But that represents the anti-Enlightenment, and that represents the smashing of the Enlightenment, the smashing of everything that was profound and beautiful. So you can understand how someone would want to not hear that and not have it performed. But the reality is that I think that the notion that somehow that it's dangerous to have it out there and performed if somehow we don't know everything about his sort of position about racism, I think that's really actually nonsense. I think you can engage with the work, be thoroughly transformed by it, be inspired by it, think it's overwhelming and remarkable and a great gift to humanity, and not even know that he's a racist. And let's be honest, many artists have very despicable views that many of us would not, but their contribution and their legacy to humanity is important. And I think in that context we really have to distinguish them, whilst recognising some of them had some of them.
You can't have ever seen Meistersinger then, because Beckmesser is someone here has written about this. Beckmesser is considered now by several scholars as being clearly an anti-Semitic caricature. And he is a major character in Meistersinger. The end of Meistersinger is a disgusting paean to the German, to the future German empire, to the future sort of united nation.
Okay,
Igor,
Hilan,
assuming
take
all
you
that
and
is
go back.
true,
Carry on, carry on.
Am I speaking to the mic?
Yeah, just.
Oh, thanks. Assuming all that is true, so what? I mean, does that mean that? What are the necessary implications of that for when Meistersingers performed? Does it mean that the audience is necessarily incapable of making the critical distinctions of saying, yes, I see that, I perceive that. Now let me see if I can relate to this work on several levels at once.
I do that, and I go to see Meistersinger, and I love Meistersinger.
How is that possible?
Well, it's very possible to have two contradictory views at the same time. In that, you can like the music, you can absolutely like the music, you can understand its place in history. It's undeniably important. Look,
I love what you just said.
My position on this panel is to offer a sort of counterpoint to the prevailing idea of Wagner as being this, forget about all this other stuff. Don't forget about it. Yes, go watch imbibe his music, enjoy it. But don't forget that there is a horrible misanthropy running through all his operas. And that we must guard against. We must guard against following the logic of his operas.
I don't for a moment want to forget about the toxic elements in his ideology. I think that's plain in the film. But the notion that this somehow makes the artwork dangerous and that somehow we're suspiciously, suggestible because of it, I think is actually dangerously Wagnerian in itself.
Okay, can I just see? There's a couple. So there's the chap in the blue jumper who was being very patient, who didn't get in. Then there's another guy down there in the middle. And can I just see if anyone else has other questions? Okay.
Yeah, basically, I mean, what I had been wondering all this time is what is so specific about Wagner's anti-Semitism? I mean, seen from a non-European point of view, when I see things that were happening in Europe from the 12th, 13th century, Jews being expelled from several countries, pogroms in Russia, all the way to the Dreyfus affair in France, anti-Semitism is not just German, it's European, it spans centuries and countries. So Wagner just happened to be one of the most high-profile anti-Semites. And yes, he was instrumentalized by the Nazi regime, but his ambivalence towards Jews is not that out of line of the European ambivalence towards Jews that just reached its highest points in the Holocaust.
Okay, I want to take just the other chap in there and just give us a couple of questions.
Hilan, I really enjoyed the documentary. I thought it was fantastic and very, I suppose gave a very good insight into the nuances of the period. My question, I suppose, relates to kind of racial thinking. There's both Wagner and his wife Cosima, I think, obviously, expressed that kind of racial outlook. And I suppose it's a question of timing, in your view. They obviously seem to be expressing something which was, on the rise in that period, and people have already mentioned, the kind of the anti-Enlightenment thought and the racial thinking. The people aren't fundamentally equal. There are distinct races in the world, and this seems to, maybe not necessarily predate Wagner's period, but definitely be kind of coterminous with it. So, to what extent should we, with the way in which he's kind of held responsible for kind of racial thinking, I think probably unfairly. I just wondered if you would kind of agree with that.
And can I see, are there any other questions? Because we're going to have to start wrapping things up shortly. Okay.
I do think it would be unfair to hold Wagner single-handedly responsible for the growth of racial thinking or racial anti-Semitism. It's true that racial anti-Semitism was on the rise at around the time that he republished the essay in 1869. The word anti-Semitism actually dates from 1870. It was coined by Wilhelm Marr, who was one of the leading anti-Jewish activists in Germany, and it was intended to connote a distinction between what was now a new racially based, rational dislike of Jews, and the previous prejudice which was grounded in religion and the notion of Jews as persecutors of Christ, and so these people in the late 19th century wants to distance themselves from that. The ancient prejudice was referred to as Judenhass, hatred of Jews, and anti-Semitism was supposed to be something entirely different and objective, because based on racial principles. Wagner did become a spokesman for that. It would be inaccurate to say that he was the progenitor of it, although interestingly enough, there's a quote in the film where he seems to happily accept credit for inspiring the movement. But again, he did give himself credit for an awful lot.
Okay. Alan or Igor, have you got anything to...
Sure. I think that on the development of racial thinking, it's clear that it's been the case even pre-modernity. There were exclusions of Jews, part of the relationship of monarchs and development of early nation states, places like Spain and elsewhere, where they would borrow money and then they would expel them, and you'd have all of those types of things happening. So it's a deep-rooted, you're absolutely right, deep-rooted trajectory looking back, pre-modernity in medieval society and before. But then something happens in the modern period, it's just, we haven't really got time to go into in lots of detail, but something happens in the modern period where there's a more systematic development of the ideas around race and racialism. As it happens, it's the elite across Europe that talk about their own peoples in that way first. They talk about the working class in many ways, and many of those ideas are imposed also on the Jews. I think the thing is that, so modern racial thinking, the idea that Wagner somehow is the perpetrator of these ideas is ludicrous. He reflects some of the prevailing ideas and sentiments. What's so exceptional about Wagner is the way he puts his art together and his work. He reflects and it resonates with some of the ideas that are around, but also they're contradictory, his ideas. And if you actually listen, you can listen to the librettist, you can also listen to what he says, and at different points he says different things. He says many things about Felix Mendelssohn at one point, and then in private he says different things about how tremendous and profound he thinks he is. He's contradictory. I think your point about him being polemical for purpose is true, and also he says things about destruction and war later on that contradict what he said earlier on. But his work, I think, is profound and consistent, and I think that the problem with taking art and then having this imposition that because you have someone who's the artist that has really horrible views. That you have to kind of keep the two together all the time and view one thing as a consequence of the other is really the wrong way round. I think you have to engage with the work as it is and see how you respond to it, and then you should have an understanding of what artists think, perhaps, but I don't think that it's the most important thing at all about the work.
I'd just like to just talk a bit more about the music, which is all that really matters, and I've tried to focus on that, the opera. What's in the opera. And I think another element to us being sceptical and finding it very problematic to listen to Wagner is the music is devoid of the words. The music itself demands surrender. It's about suffocation. It's not about consensual love. It's not about, and he doesn't do consensual love very well in his operas. There's a lot of real suffocation, in terms of forcing people to love them through various means. But his music demands this suffocating subservience and submission, which Cosima had this disgusting sort of magician-assistant relationship, like Paul Daniels and Debbie McGee in a sort of nightmarish kind of horror film version. But he kind of demands this in his music. He demands submission, and I think that is very dangerous. That concept, the idea of transcendence, the idea of Schopenhauer that he transmits so well and so popularly, is dangerous and anti-humanistic and leads to horrible implications.
Okay, I think we should wrap up now. So can we just thank the panel for their contributions? If that's fine, can we just say a round of applause? One thing I'll say is that I appreciate if you're kind of so proud of Wagnerian, you discuss these sort of questions a lot of the time. I have to say, as somebody who sort of follows arts debates and sits side of it, you often is a division between you're either taught to revere Wagner somewhat uncritically, or you get taught to view him as a dead white male who had repellent views on many different things. It's very rare that you have the opportunity to actually, seriously engage in the questions about what his operas are dealing with, the big artistic questions that he raises, and to have that done so fascinatingly by the panel. So that's what we try to do with the Battle of Ideas. We try to probe a little bit deeper, go beyond some of the headlines, and actually, if not come up with the right answers, at least come up with more useful questions to do so. So I think all of the panel did a very good job of actually putting some very difficult questions and to think about the topic in a new way. Hilan's film obviously did a fantastic job of really making you think about Wagner in a way in which you rarely do. So I'd like to thank all of the panel. I'd like to thank again Gali and Robert, who I know have been working incredibly hard to bring this film to life and make this event happen. I hope to see you all at the Battle of Ideas next week, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.